we really are looking outside of ourselves. We want that confirmation. We're looking for it. And here's somebody, the Sitchin or others, who are providing that confirmation for us, and they're confirming it from ancient texts. The topic, by the way, is not at all controversial for Mesopotamian scholars. It's like, what's the big deal?
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast. I'm Keegan Walls, your curious layman, and today, as always, I am here with the Jackie Chan of ancient studies because he can mentally kick your butt. Doctor and scholar Mark Chavalas.
I would rather have you throw a balloon at me. By the way, the other day the balloon did not pop. I thought it would because, of course, most scholars have pointy heads. But
well, we found out you have the roundiest head of all.
Evidently.
I could have introed you that way, too. So there you go. Yeah. The Kung Fu scholar, Mark Chavalas. That's what they call him around his inner circles, which just consists of me at this point.
And I'm impressed because I do know who Jackie Chan is, because my kids, when they were younger, were obsessed with his movies. And so.
Awesome. Well, today we're excited to start a new little mini-series, and today we're going to be talking about one of the most controversial topics surrounding in trying to connect the Bible with Mesopotamian myth and ancient aliens, things like that. And so today we are going to be discussing the Anunnaki, and then also the planet Nibiru, which will be its own separate little episode. So today we're going to be talking about the Anunnaki and ancient aliens. Are there aliens out there? And so to start out, Mark, we're a Bible podcast, obviously. And so my first question, and maybe some people are even wondering, as a Bible podcast, why even address or bring up the topic of the Anunnaki?
Well, first of all, I might be sitting next to an alien, but other than that, that is a really good question, because if you would have asked me this about a year and a half ago, I would have said, what? The topic, by the way, is not at all controversial for Mesopotamian scholars. It's like, what's the big deal? It's a pretty generic word. It's hardly ever used in Mesopotamian documents, and so why are you bothered by it? So I had to figure that out. But when I peruse the internet, and it's sort of hard not to, if you put that word up, you get so much stuff, and a lot of it is from Christians and from Bible-believing Christian people. And I thought, where are they getting this information? I'm absolutely perplexed by this. This was never on my radar when I was doing cuneiform studies. I mean, I knew the word, but it's like, some obscure, divine being term that it's the pantheon. So what's the big deal? So I was quite perplexed, but the fact that there's so much misinformation out there, I thought, okay, I probably should say something about it. And I'm not the only one that has. I want to give credit to Mike Kaiser, though he's not a cuneiform scholar. He did a really, really great service. If you look up Anunnaki to see what on Google Scholar, I'm going to guess what'll come up will be 4 main articles about the Anunnaki. They're all in German, by the way, and they're all incredibly technical. And so what did Mike Kaiser do a few years ago? He decides to have the 4 articles translated into English by somebody named Dorothea Clapper. And so here's the book, The Anunnaki Gods According to Ancient Mesopotamian Sources. And so the 4 articles are in here. They're extremely technical, and they're just as complicated to understand in English as they are in German, by the way. And then Mike has a nice summary at the end, and though he's not a cuneiform scholar, I thought he did a very credible job trying to put together the material. And so I applaud him for that. However, I think there's always reason, just like if you hear somebody give a talk on Romans 3, it's always good to hear somebody else give a talk on Romans 3. And so I'm going to give you my bird's eye view from Mesopotamia as how I would look at this material. And for those of you who are all excited about this, you're probably going to be a little underwhelmed.
I feel like you've said that every episode.
Well, you're going to be really underwhelmed if you think of that. So, and then let me continue on. About a year and a half ago, I was invited, I'm not going to say which podcast, but I was invited by a podcast to come on and talk about Mesopotamia. And I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. And then they sent me, before we got on, some of the questions. And one of them, the main question was about the Anunnaki. And I'm thinking, why does he want to know about the Anunnaki? I suppose Mesopotamian scholars live in their little bubble. And so I looked it up and said, okay, so they're hardly ever mentioned in Mesopotamian texts. What's the big deal? And then he wanted me to connect the Anunnaki with Elohim and the planet Nibiru and all this other stuff. I'm thinking, wow, where did he get this stuff? And then he mentioned some scholars, and a couple of them were well-known Sumerologists, but then there are a few others, like somebody named Sitchin and Bellino, I think, an Italian fellow. I'm thinking, I don't know who these guys are. And, especially the field of Sumerology is really small. If you think Assyriology, the study of cuneiform languages, is small, then it's hyper small when you get down to being a Sumerologist. And though I studied Sumerian, I'm not a Sumerologist. That's such a tiny focus. And so if you put a scholar's name in there, it's like, how would I not know who they are? There's like 3 of them in the world, and there's maybe 4. But I'm by the way, I'm exaggerating to make a point here. And so I looked them up, and I said, oh my goodness, this person wrote their stuff in the 80s and 90s, when of course the average person didn't have access to internet material. And though I didn't read the books, I read a little bit of here and there, and just, what you do is usually do a litmus test. You see, if you want to see what somebody says about a Sumerian word, you find out, right, what do they say about the etymology? And then you realize they made a mistake that you would make in the first day of Sumerian class, and your professor and the other graduate students would call you on it. And you would either, run home with your tail between your legs, intellectually speaking, or you would figure out, oh, that's not how we do things. All right. And so I found out there was so much misinformation out there. It was so perplexing to me. And like I said, the Christian world seems to have bought into a lot of this too, because it's sensationalistic, and maybe it appeals to people's sensibilities. Man, would this be cool if we found out space aliens are connected to biblical texts, to other ancient texts, etc. And, as a kid, I read von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods and got excited for at least 15 minutes before I was put in my place. And when I'm saying that, I was put in my place by myself, like, oh, how does this match up with this, this, and this? If so-and-so's premise is wrong, that means everything else is wrong. Kind of like watching a National Geographic special. Start with their premise. If you miss their premise, the whole thing has just been wasted, because it's usually a wrong premise. Okay.
Yeah. No. Yeah, that makes sense. So, which I would say agreed. Before we decided we're going to do this, I wouldn't say I looked hard into it, but it has become so mainstream that even people like me, like if you're on the internet or you're looking up anything Christian or Nephilim or Book of Enoch and trying to learn any kind of background context to the Bible, but even as like a Bible believing Christian, like you're still getting into some of these other things, at least hearing about them. And it's become so mainstream that people are connecting the dots and thinking things that aren't true about them. And I would argue hearing from people who claim to be scholars who are not scholars and don't have the credibility to speak on it because they don't, or they're self-taught in the cuneiform language. So this is by far a mainstream topic. Maybe if you haven't heard of the Anunnaki, you're better off. But we're gonna dive into it, and so I'll turn it over to you, and let's talk about these ancient aliens, even if they are, unless they're not those.
Well, again, the fact that you bring it up with that word, I think already proves my point that you could very well be an alien. So, and so I think that I'm preaching against the choir, I'm guessing right now. But anyway, all in good fun. So let me start off by talking about the etymology of the word. Anunnaki, by the way, it's an Akkadian word, but it's a loan word from Sumerian. And I think if you look at some of my earlier podcasts, I talk about the fact that Sumerian and Akkadian are the first two cuneiform languages that we know of, and they're so intertwined. When cuneiform writing comes to the forefront, it's pretty obvious that Sumerian and Akkadian have already been interacting for centuries before all this. And so loanwords are going back and forth quite a bit. In fact, we thought loanwords were only going from Sumerian to Akkadian. Now we understand that it's actually going back and forth in many respects. And the two languages couldn't be more different. I made this statement before, and I'll say it again. Sumerian and Akkadian is kind of like they are close to each other as English is to Chinese. Okay, the only similarity is that they're spoken by humans on the same planet. Other than that, every aspect it's not just different words. It's like every aspect of how you put language together is different. So how could they come together like this? We don't know. And of course, maybe theological standpoint, you would bring up maybe the Babel story, and I will talk about the Babel story at some point, and because I want to. And so the etymology of the term, I was even asked on podcasts, more than one podcast, doesn't it mean something about, sons of Anu? I said, no, why would you think that? So I began looking it up, and in Sumerian, the second part of the term, the nun, is the word for royalty or prince. The first term, the is the one that's probably been bothersome or confusing to people. And so, how would I look this up? So this is how I did my research. I first went to the materials for the Sumerian lexicon, which of course everyone would do. Here's volume 14. It was originated by Benno Landsberger, who was one of my great uncle professors. This one was 1979, so Landsberger was already passed by now. And so it was taken on by the greatest Sumerologist probably in the last 50 years, Miguel Seville, with others. And in this, it's basically a line-by-line lexicon where it shows a Sumerian word, and then it gives the phonetic word in Akkadian, which of course sounds like, all right, why are you telling me this? Because this is probably done beginning in the old Babylonian period when Sumerian is probably dying out or has already died out as a spoken language, but it's not dead as a scribal language. And so if you're a scribe worth your salt, you're learning both Akkadian and Sumerian, or I should say it in the other way around, Sumerian and Akkadian. Akkadian is still being spoken as far as we can tell. Abraham, by the way, is probably living in this environment, but he's an Amorite. That's another story we'll talk about. So, but since Sumerian is kind of like maybe Latin in the late Middle Ages, or even in the Catholic Church until the last century or two, you'd still have to know some Latin if you want to do liturgy, and so but nobody would be using it in daily life language, and if they did, of course, that would be sort of weird. We homeschooled our kids, and I taught them a little Latin phrases here and there, and of course, I didn't realize they would start using it with their friends and their dad. So anyway, I'm materials for the Sumerian lexicon, volume 14. I go to page 89, text number 2.3. I go down there, line 4.6, and it has the Sumerogram all the way through it. It gives the different meanings of the term. One of them is Rihu-utum. Actually, it's Rihu-utu-tum. I won't explain all that right now. Think, all right, Rihu-tum. That's an Akkadian word. All right, so whatever, and by the way, this is actually how we were able to learn Sumerian, is by these lexicons. Without them, it would have been incredibly difficult to figure out the Sumerian language, which is still I mean, you can write grammars on them, and I was taught by one of the best, Mikulovsky. So you have to look up this word. I said, all right, how am I going to find out what this word means? Now, by the way, as a graduate student back in the 70s, you would use the handy-dandy Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, which I think I've shown you before. Well, I won't show it. I'm going to show it later on with Nibiru. Unfortunately, the R volume hadn't been published yet. And so that was a bummer. In fact, I remember sitting in the library at UCLA, and you'd have to go and look up a particular word, and you knew, oh no, this is a word it's the Shin volume, the SH sound. And, oh, that hasn't been published yet. What do we do? Oh, that's no problem, the professor said. Just use the German volume. It's already done. Oh, no. German's harder than Akkadian is. So here it is. If I can get it, it's pretty heavy. This was done by Wolfram von Soden, Akkadische Handwörterbuch. Pardon my German. And so you look up the German term rehtu or rehum. Excuse me, I'm sorry, rehu. And in German, begotten, zeugen. You know, it has something to do with, impregnating or seed or whatever. And by the way, since then, we do have the R volume. I didn't buy it because you can get the whole thing online, by the way. If you want to do this, which you certainly can, I think anybody can do it. Simply Google Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, and it'll come up, and you can actually download any of the volumes and have the whole thing gum up your computer. And so I look up the Rehu just to see whether my German is correct. And guess what? Rehu means to sire or to beget, to inseminate, etc. So I got my answer to what the term means. It means something like princely seed. Okay. I suppose if this was Latin, it would be classicus, or the word that we might use in English would be aristocrat. Okay. You're upper class. You're at the top of the crust compared to everybody else. And guess what? The term Anunnaki in some administrative texts is clearly talking about humans, not divine beings. But most of the time that it is used for divine beings, understandably, because of course divine beings are, they're the higher class seed. We're just the after effects of things. And so that's how you do that. Now, I think many have made mistakes with Sumerian and Akkadian, so I'm just going to bring this up. If you were going to be looking up signs to see how they're used, you would use Labat's Manual d'Epigraphie Akkadienne, which has been revised a number of times. It originally came out, I think, right about 1939, I'm guessing, or thereabouts. But it's been revised, and it'll have the history of each sign, what it looked like, how it evolved over time, because we're thinking of 2,500 plus years, what each value means, and then if you really want to make sure that you're doing things right, you're going to look up some grammars, okay, and though they're still a little old-fashioned, I think they're the best. If you want to look up an Akkadian grammar, the one that I used for 20 years while I was teaching was John Cuneiform's A Grammar of Akkadian, which is, in many respects, except for the cuneiform part, you can pretty much self-teach. An Akkadian, like I'd said before, is very close to biblical Hebrew, or at least close enough that you can understand it. And he talks about cuneiform signs. When I took Sumerian, there was no grammar yet, by the way, but a little bit later on, a colleague of mine, John Hayes, made a manual of Sumerian grammar. What a great name, by the way. And so in both of these fellows, when they talk about signs, they'll bring it up this way. When you look at a particular cuneiform sign, it can have a logographic value, which basically means an entire word. It can have a syllabic value, which would be, well, a syllable. And they're usually, for example, in Akkadian, your syllables can be either vowel consonant, like an ab, or a consonant vowel, or a ba, or a consonant vowel consonant, like a bab. Almost never will you find a vowel consonant vowel, and if you do, it's probably a foreign word. And don't ask me why about that. The problem is that each sign can have multiple values, either syllabic values or logographic values. And by the way, I'm being very simplistic right now. And you only know that through context. So, for example, when I taught Akkadian, I would, though the students were chomping at the bit, oh, we want to learn the signs. I said, no, you have to learn the language first. We have to spend at least about a month or two figuring out the rudiments of the language, because otherwise you would be buried with the script. You have to sort of know what's going to come next. I mean, if I wrote something in English to you and I didn't divide any of the letters, you would know enough to know, well, this word ends here and this word begins here. And so, you would know, for example, if I wrote COWWORKER, or no, I'm sorry. Yep. Well, there's not two W's. If I wrote co-worker, you would probably know that I'm not talking about a cow orker, because, of course, there are cows, but I don't know what an orker is, unless, of course, it's something out of Lord of the Rings. So the whole point in Akkadian Sumerian script, you have to know how to look at the signs and anticipate what's there. And like I said, each sign has the potential of a logographic value or a syllabic value or a determinative value. In other words, if I'm talking about a boat that's made out of wood, I'll have the wood sign in front of it. Or if I want to make sure you know that this particular individual is a divine being, I would put the divinity marker before the person's name. That gets confusing when you have a divinity mentioned in somebody's personal name. But anyway, there's lots of confusing stuff, and you've just got to be trained in it. And so when I found out that somebody like this Sitchin guy basically did it on his own, I can look at somebody's etymology for something, and I can sort of tell exactly what they did wrong. And it also means I can also sort of tell where they got their information. It wasn't from the dusty old cuneiform books. It was probably from Sitchin or somebody like him. So I just want you to be aware of that. And so we'll just go from there. The term Anunnaki means princely seed. The remainder of that term, by the way, though it's been Akkadianized, it's comes from Sumerian grammatical endings that I'm not going to discuss right now. Also tells us quite often about how Sumerian was loaned into Akkadian and sometimes even into, ultimately from Akkadian into Biblical Hebrew. There are a few words that made the cut all the way through. All right. Are you bored yet?
No, I love it.
Okay. All right. Well, that just proves you're an alien, by the way. All right. Now.
Well, maybe I'll just jump before you go full in on this.
Jump.
Yep. So Sitchin's work, most people would be familiar with Sitchin, and if they're not familiar with Sitchin, the person that they're probably listening to online gets most of their stuff from Sitchin, if they believe the alien context to it. So, like, do you know any of the specifics of what Sitchin did incorrect in terms of his cuneiform study?
Not really, except that all I did was look up a couple of the etymologies and realized he had no understanding of the basic rudiments of cuneiform. And I can't even give you an example right now because it's like I'd rather look at the real. And I think I already told you this story. Maybe I didn't. I don't know. But about a decade and a half ago, a student came into my office, and he was from another school, and said, "Hey, I heard you teach Sumerian." I said, "Well, hardly, but yeah, I teach it once in a while." "Oh, I've been studying Sumerologists," and he mentioned Sitchin's name, and at the time I had never heard of the guy. I said, "I don't know who this guy is. I've never heard of him." "Oh, he's a great Sumerologist," and I said, "Let me look him up on my computer." And I said, "Oh, He's not a Sumerologist. He did this, and that. Those aren't Sumerological works, and he didn't study with anybody. And it says he knew Samuel Noah Kramer. Well, I knew him too, but that wouldn't make me a Sumerologist just because I knew somebody. So, and so I sort of burst the poor guy's bubble, and then I promptly forgot about the person. Think, well, I try hard to stay in my scholarly little bubble, and so I just promptly forgot about it, never heard about the issue again until it was brought up to me about a year and a half ago. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. And now since then I've looked up, and if you really want to get the scoop on him, again, Mike Heiser has done such a great service. You look Mike Heiser, he actually has a website called Sitchin is Wrong. I think it's .com or whatever. And he did his homework, and he probably got a lot of flack for it, I'm guessing. And so good for you, Mike. I'm such a valued resource, and for him to do that, especially since, from what I can tell, he was not trained in cuneiform. He really did an Herculean labor to try to put this material together using the right scholars to work through it. Okay, so I can't tell you a whole lot else, and I'd rather not go into the weeds. I looked at one website that was arguing back and forth with him, and I found out one of the writers who, and this is probably 25 years ago, one of the writers that was going back and forth with them was Pyotr Mikhailovsky, who was probably one of the top 5 Sumerologists in the world in the past half century, and he happened to have been one of my teachers. And so I'm thinking, okay, and Pyotr would say a few things here and there, and then just pull out like, all right, and he wasn't getting real far with the crowd, so I think he just sort of pulled back. But I realized, all right, if Mikhailovsky isn't getting to them, there's no way I'm going to venture into this. And so I'm just going to do the best I can, trying to figure this out and talk about where the Anunnaki are mentioned, from what period, and try to piece together what it means, and then its relevance or lack thereof for biblical studies.
All right.
So,
awesome. Let's do it.
All right. So just got a note or two here and there. So the term, by the way, Anunnaki, is found, I think the earliest evidence for it is from the period of Gudea. And I'm sure you're thinking, oh, Gudea, who's Gudea?
Yeah, that's what I would have said.
Gudea is a Sumerian king of the city of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia, right around a little before 2100 BC, we estimate right now. A whole cache of documents from his period. The most interesting text for Bible students for Gudea is a very interesting text describing a dream that Gudea has, a divine dream about him building a temple. And it's remarkably similar in structure to what's happening with Solomon in the Bible. In fact, one of the few Bible-believing Sumerologists in the world, Dick Averbeck, is probably one of the top Gudea scholars in the world. What a
claim!
What
to
a
fame.
thing to claim, Dick. But anyway, he has written massive amounts of work looking at the Gudea cylinders, and occasionally he'll make a connection with the Solomonic work. And so just look up Dick Averbeck for that. So anyway, the Anunnaki, the term is used. I'm not sure exactly where the administrative texts are, whether they're with Gudea or a little bit later with Sumerian texts from Ur in the Ur III dynasty 100 years later. But we have a handful of administrative texts that talk about Anunnaki, and I'm guessing without the divine determinative, and so these are probably humans that are interacting, so they're princely class. But the term appears to take on more of a divine flavor, and I'm not exactly sure when, but certainly by the old Babylonian period, which would be Hammurabi, etc. So this is around 19th, 18th century BC. We start having more information about the term Anunnaki. They appear in some epics and later on in some curse formulas. But just like the Abkalu that I talked about, and just like the Nephilim, they're never the main subject of anything. So there's never a cult to the Anunnaki. There's never in one individual Anunnaki god with a personal name, although I think that if you think of the term meaning the pantheon of gods, that means all the gods are, in some respects, Anunnaki. It also means over about a 1,500-year period, the term is modified. And I know I've used this example before, but I can't think of a better one. It's kind of like the word American. Use the term American, let's say in 1625. It's going to have a vastly different meaning than it would in 2025 or even 1776 or whatever. And so are you talking about the political state, the continent, some Italian guy's first name? And again, in other words, and even today, you have to have a context when you use the term American. Okay. Are you talking about a basketball league? The ABA or the American baseball. In other words, it doesn't have the same meaning, obviously. And I think the Anunnaki are the same. But when you start looking up some texts, so for example, I brought my handy-dandy law collections from Mesopotamia and Asia Minor from this wonderful series called SBL, Society of Biblical Literature Writings from the Ancient World series. It's probably got about 50 or 60 of these wonderful volumes out that basically have a lot of ancient texts, often have good, solid biblical connections, but it also provides a nice context. A lot of them now that were published in the 90s, you can find as PDF files online. I believe you can with this one by Martha Roth. And I'm looking at the beginning of the Hammurabi Code, which we will talk about at some point, the law code. And Hammurabi has a prologue at the beginning of this, and he says, when the august god Anu, who's the king of the gods in the Sumerian and Akkadian pantheons, in Sumerian his name would be An, in Akkadian they give him a grammatical form at the end of his name, a declension. He's called Anu, or sometimes Anu. He's the king of the gods. He's also the king of the Anunnaki deities, it says. Who are they? Then it continues on and also talks about the Igigi deities. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between them. I don't know what it is, but nothing is ever explained. We have no manual telling us who these guys are, but it looks like a general term. In other words, if I want to talk about the gods altogether, I can use simply the plural gods, or I can use the term Anunnaki, or Anunnaki. Anunnaki would be the nominative form of it. But I know, what's that? That's like the subject. We don't have these endings in English, which is really cool. Once in a while we do, like who and whom, and no one knows how to use who or whom anymore. And if you use it correctly, it's like you're an old person who's an old curmudgeon. And I don't even have to be old to be a curmudgeon. But so where was I? So Anu
and Anunnaki.
Yeah. So, and by the way, the term sometimes is Anuna, Anunnaki, or whatever. That shows that it's, anyway, it makes sense. So anyways, so they're invoked. And sometimes you'll use the term to invoke like all of them. Okay, we're going to find that a little bit later on in some texts. And sometimes the pantheons are different. In other words, if you're a Sumerian from Lagash and I'm a Sumerian from Nippur, guess what? Our pantheons aren't the same. Our collection of gods are not, they overlap tremendously, especially with the big top gods. But we've got some personal gods over here that are pretty local to Nippur, and you got your own personal gods that are pretty local. And so if I'm visiting Lagash, I want to make sure that I'm submitting myself to the local deities. Other deities are national, I suppose, or they're all over the place. And so my Anunnaki deities might not be the same as your Anunnaki deities. In other words, my pantheon is a little different than yours. But since we're not monotheists, we don't think of this in this exclusive way at all, if this makes any sense. Stop me if it doesn't, but not every time. No.
Yeah, we'd be stopping every 5 minutes. No, but okay, so Anunnaki is referring to the overall big national pantheon of gods, but also local. But is it always referring to the pantheon, not individualistic deities?
Except when it isn't.
Lovely.
Okay. Yeah. See. But you got to realize we're dealing with documents over millennia of time in different areas. Can you imagine trying to figure this out with just like a generic word in English and saying, well, it meant this to Shakespeare and then it meant this to Chaucer, but it's really different over here in central Iowa in 1850. It seems to have a different meaning. It's because, of course, words change over time. Meanings are modified. I remember when I was a kid, I remember people starting using the word impacted, that impacted me. And I'm thinking, wow, the only time we ever used the word impact was when you had an impacted tooth. And you could make it impact, but you would never impact somebody. In other words, they made a new word. Humongous. I think it made the dictionary, but if I would have used the word among us, I probably would have been rapped on my knuckles as a kid. Like, that's not a word. Don't use that word. It was slang that became a new word. So it's just words change over time, and so it's not surprising to find out that the term Anunnaki is going to have a meaning that is modified, over time. By the way, Mike even did a great job here. This is Dingir, which is the divinity marker. Nun, Na, Ne, K. And so, in other words, he put it in there nicely. It's Neo-Assyrian period, too. It's not even early document. Yes.
And so Anunnaki is not, so who's the god? Anu? So, but it's
it has nothing to do with Anu. I was asked, does this mean they're descended from Anu? Well,
you can see how that can. I mean, it's
yes, but that's because somebody doesn't understand how to look up cuneiform signs. See, you can't do that. You can't phoneticize something that is got a syllabic value to it. It doesn't work that way. Nun is the sign for prince. You can't write it nu-un. It's not possible. And so Anu happens to be, sometimes it'll say that Anu is the generator of the Anunnaki, but then sometimes it says Ea is. And so it probably depends on somebody's pantheon. It also doesn't necessarily mean that they're all spawned from him biologically. And even if it did, that would be irrelevant, in my opinion.
So it's kind of making a connection just because it's similar.
Yeah. But it's not. I was asked that recently on a Christian podcast, and I sort of jumped up, no, and I'm sorry, I'm getting excited. It's not your fault. And so, I get emotional about Anunnaki. What's the matter with me? So I know this is going really slowly here. So the term is found in some Sumerian and Akkadian epics, mostly in Akkadian epics. And so how is it used there? Like I said, they're never the main characters. They usually have bit parts, okay? Because it's like the whole group of gods. So let's look up, I think I've shown you this before, Stephanie Dowley's Myth from Mesopotamia, which is a really nice little volume with about 7 or 8 of the myths, Akkadian and Sumerian, but most of the ones that were written into Akkadian. And we can start off in the Epic of Creation. And I'll just recite a little bit of it. This is the Epic of Creation, the Enuma Elish, which is their greatest if anything was close to being a sacred text in Mesopotamia, it probably would be this one, at least for Babylon. It has actually alternate versions. At Nineveh, the Assyrians actually changed the name of the god from Marduk to Ashur. But we'll talk. I think I mentioned that before. But anyway, it says I'm in tablet number 6, about line 39 or so. It says, for Nudimud, which is one of Ea's old names, performed it with the miracles of Marduk. Then Marduk the king divided the gods. The Anunnaki, all of them, which probably means all of the gods, really, above and below, he assigned to his decrees to Anu to guard. Okay? And then later, little bit later on, we're told 300 got a heavenly appointment and 300 got a netherworld appointment. Okay? For, if this was angelic beings, it would be 300 up in heaven and 300 down in hell. Bummer. Although the netherworld in Mesopotamia isn't necessarily always a negative place. It's a negative place for humans because you go there and it's sort of amorphous and you can't leave. But gods can sort of interact. Yes.
So more like the realm of the dead.
Yes.
As opposed to looking at it like hell.
And so there's no intimation here that the lower Anunnaki got a bum deal necessarily. I mean, we would look at it and say that's a bum deal, but and of course the Anunnaki aren't speaking for themselves. When they do, they're not speaking as Anunnaki, they're speaking as themselves. The Anunnaki also, by the way, in the flood story, in the Atrahasis story, not in Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki are the ones who are assigned by Marduk to start making temples and dredging canals and doing all the hard labor. And they work at it for a year or more and they complain bitterly, hey, this is really hard work. We're princely guys. Why do we have to do this? And I'm sort of paraphrasing, and Marduk ends up saying, okay, guys, something, I'll make some slaves for you that'll do the dirty work for you. And that's us, by the way. All I can tell you is that if you're a Mesopotamian, you got a really poor self-esteem anthropology. It's like, we're just, at least in Israel, you might be made of dust, but God said, you're a little dust creature, but I'm going to make you into an image bearer. That's a better deal.
Sign me up for that one.
And I'm saying that tongue in cheek. It's a really better deal. And that's one of the fundamental differences. If you're an Israelite, you're saying, yeah, I'm going to buy into this. This is a little better. This anthropology explains, though I've got a really tough life here, it explains the fact that God has some really good plans for me. In Mesopotamia, there are no good plans, after all this. And so anyway, the Anunnaki get off their hard labor kick, and humans start doing it. And so where are they mentioned anywhere else? After that, they're mostly described from the netherworld. So in other words, does this mean that they're not up are there anymore? It means that it's no longer a point. And like I said, you can't look at each myth as if, all right, here's divinely information over here and divine information over here. And oh my goodness, it doesn't look like it's the same. These are two different traditions that have been melded together. And so just like our two towns would have different traditions, although really they're not that different. If I go to McDonald's, in my town, and I go to McDonald's in California, there might be a little bit of differences, but they're still McDonald's. Or if I go to one to Italy or in Austria, like I have, it's like, wow, these are really different, but they're still McDonald's, except that you can get some really cool things there that you can't get here. But in other words, there's modifications, but it's still Mesopotamian pantheon stuff. Okay, so are we good so far?
Yeah, I think the one thing that's going on in my head is, so it means like the seed, right? Seed of
princely seed.
Princely seed. But then the way we're looking at it, it looks like deity language. So.
Yes, they're godlike beings. And by the way, are they always upper class gods? Probably, but again, there's no explanation for it. Are there only 600 because Marduk said there's only 600? That's in the Enuma Elish tradition. I don't think you find it anywhere else. And so there's lots of them. Sometimes they're listed with a certain number. And so nobody's trying to give you a canonical number about how many there are or where they are.
So is there a differentiation within the language or the text between the heavenly and then the earthly ones when the Anunnaki are used for like humans and then the Anunnaki that are used for
the Anunnaki
deity?
are never described as humans in any mythical text. They're only mentioned in early administrative texts, and to my knowledge, once you get to the period of the old Babylonian period, I don't know whether there are any administrative texts that still use the term for humans. In other words, I think at that point it's completely a heavenly term. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure. There is, like I said before, there's no cult of the Anunnaki, because of course you want to, and if there was, it would be kind of like what Paul says in Acts. You have a tomb, a statue to the unknown God, which means that I don't know which God helped me, so I'll just pray to that one. But it's not even a collective there. So I don't know. All I can say is that in later periods, the Anunnaki appear to be connected to the netherworld and less and less to the heavenly world. In fact, maybe it's almost exclusive. So one or two other texts, and then we'll be mercifully, done with this. And you're thinking, wait a minute, isn't there more? No. By the way, their connection to a term called the Igigi, I-G-I-G-I, sometimes they're the same and sometimes they're different. And so it might be a different tradition about the gods, but so I don't know what the actual connection is. It seems to be a slight nuanced term, kind of like a term that I can't think of one in English, that you would know that this term is very similar to this other term, but they're not congruent. They're not identical. And so that seems to be the term Igigi. And so a Mesopotamian probably would know when they would want to use one term or the other, but I couldn't tell you what that is. But for example, the term is written out often Dinger Nun Gal Ene, and the Nun there is again the same term for prince, and Gal is the word for large, and so these are big princes. Is it a particular group of Anunnaki? I don't know.
Big princes, like giants?
Don't
I
even,
know, I'm just kidding.
Wow. Yeah. All right. Listen, you were giant. First of all, I have a really tough time because I'm a Dodger fan, so anything to do with giants, it's like I start getting hives.
Everybody that heard giants there thought football giants, not baseball. That's the sport people still watch.
Well, as a little kid, you had to say New York Football Giants because there was a New York Baseball Giants. Yeah. That was really little, by the way. I could bring my Brooklyn Dodger hat with me because all my heroes when I was a little kid, even though I was raised in L.A., they were all Brooklyn Dodgers who moved. And one of them is still alive. His name's Sandy Koufax, although he wasn't exactly a star with Brooklyn. All right, sorry, let's go on.
Back to the Anunnaki.
Yes. So here's an article by Takayoshi Oshima, Japanese Sumerologist, about a new mythological text about Marduk and other gods. And just to show you how weird this is, the text is called A7882, it's a Neo-Assyrian tablet acquired by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. It was originally purchased in Baghdad in January of 1930 by Henry Frankfurt, and then donated to the Institute. I'm not exactly sure when. And then it sits there in the tablet room until somebody decides to take a look at it. And so it's now being published by this fellow. This was actually published about 10 or 15 years later, but this is a fragment of a text. Most of them are, by the way. And so you look at it and say, all right, maybe this might be connected to this other text. And Marduk, the king of the gods, is having some trouble in this text, by the way. Enlil is talking to Marduk, and he's opened his mouth, and he said to the gods of Anunnaki, because you were disturbed, now you shall catch your Anunnaki. And it looks as if each of the super divine beings have their own Anunnaki. By the way, what that means is they probably have their own subordinate pantheon of gods. So in other words, it has a slightly nuanced meaning there. You've got the pantheon of gods, then each super god might have his own subordinate pantheon. At least that's the implication here by this term. So if you're super god Enlil, he's one of the big three. You might have your own group of Anunnaki. It's kind of like the word Elohim in the Bible. It's like, you only know how to use that term, how the term is used in a context. Somebody wrote Elohim, that's a plural term, so that it can't be God. And I wrote, well, actually, the term Elohim can have a singular verb and a plural verb. End of discussion. How does that work? I don't know, but it works. So anyway, so how does this work with the other times that the term is used? I don't know. Now, the term Anunnaki did survive in other cuneiform cultures, especially the Hittites. Cool. Okay, and how is it used with the Hittites? It's kind of used like Latin would be if you're, first it's used in treaties. Okay, so, if I'm Hittite king and I want to make a treaty with you, and let's say you're the Egyptian king, you've got your Egyptian gods over here, I got my Hittite gods over here, and when I swear my treaty, we're gonna make a treaty as long as we are rulers. We got our treaties, and we're going to invoke our gods. Okay, and I think I mentioned this before. This is what Jacob and Laban do, except Laban invokes two gods, the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, those two gods. In other words, he's still a polytheist. Jacob invokes the God of the fear of Isaac, which means the one God, the one that my dad worshiped, which is the one that his dad worshiped. End of discussion. One God. Well, here there are multiple gods, and when the Hittites are describing them, first of all, it's the pantheon of 1,000 gods. And then for them, the Anunnaki are the netherworld gods, and it's a foreign term that they got. I know you're going to love this, from the Hurrians, who were another cuneiform people group living in northern Syria and southern area of southeastern Turkey, and further on into former Soviet Union, etc., with another different language, but they seem to be the cultural conduit for cuneiform civilization to end up in central Turkey, where the Hittites take it in the late part of the second millennium, roughly between around 16 and 1200 BC. And so now they're using it for their own language, and they've got this cool term. And by the way, the Hurrian for the Hittites was kind of like Old Latin was for if you want to invoke something sacred. And even if you're doing it for magic reasons, you're invoking it, kind of like using the term abracadabra or whatever. You're using this gobbledygook, which, by the way, isn't mumbo jumbo. It's a real, look it up in Latin, it means something, and it's pretty uncool, like open up the corpse or something. It's like, oh, I don't think I'm going to have my kids use that anymore, So when you're invoking a treaty, you might mention the word Anunnaki, and it's the underworld gods. And then lastly, when you're, this was written by the names of primeval gods, Alfonso Archi, Orientalia 59, 1990. Alfonso Archi, by the way, he probably would be rather known as a nice, he owns some farmland in northern Italy, wonderful cuneiform scholar that I got to meet. And when I talked to him, when I saw him in Italy, the first thing he asked me is, how about that farmer that you know? One of my best friends, Stephen Reimer, was a farmer up in Central California who happened to study ancient Near Eastern stuff. And he just wanted to know about farming. And I said, yeah, he's farming. I don't know what to tell you. But anyway, so he talks about this. And then another Hittite scholar, by the way, if you're a Hittite scholar, you're a Hittitologist. How's that for your resume? Billie Jean Collins has an article, Necromancy, Fertility, and the Dark Earth, the Use of Ritual Pits in the Hittite Cult. And in this, when you're trying to ward off evil spirits, like I talked about the other day with the Abkalo, you're invoking the netherworld gods, the underworld gods. And why? Because you want them to receive the junk that you're sending down there. Okay, I've got all this impurity, or I've got this demonic force, or whatever it is. Could you guys receive it and then keep it down there? And so the Anunnaki are good guys, but they're clearly underworld gods for the Hittites. So after that, I think they're occasionally mentioned in Neo-Assyrian sources, but they're still got the Mesopotamian view, mostly underworld, and that's about it. And then that's about it. They're not found in Jewish sources. They're not found in the Bible. And I'm just going to guess here because I don't know how the mechanism worked, and I frankly don't want to know. But evidently, Sitchin and his ilk must have did their self-study of Sumerian and Cuneiform and found this term and sort of locked onto it and then created this whole scenario about space aliens. I told you everything I know, just about everything I know, except for maybe duplications of material about the Anunnaki from Mesopotamian sources. And that's, at least in a short summary in this, hour session, that's about it.
So that's all the text, and it's just clearly pantheon.
It's just a generic word for pantheon, princely seed.
So then where does the jump come from to all the connected, seemingly made up connected dots to these space aliens, and then Nibiru, which we're going to talk about on the next episode? So do you know where the jump came from?
I would only know if I decided to do a deep dive into all that stuff, and I've decided not to. I'd rather first since I've only known about this problem for a year and a half. I remember when the person asked me about Anunnaki, I'm thinking, Anunnaki? Nobody studies the Anunnaki, do they? And so I looked it up, and I only looked up my handy dandy cuneiform sources and nothing else. And this is the stuff I came up with. And so, and I didn't know much else. And so when this person was interviewing me, they kept on asking me about, what about this and what about Sitchin? I said, there's nothing. He said, aren't there Mesopotamian sources that talk about them doing this and doing that? I said, no, there aren't anywhere. I know of none. I said, I said, it's not, this isn't a badge of honor, but I was forced to read a lot of this stuff, Enuma, Elish, etc., in the original language. And it's like, this was very painful to work through. And so believe me, if it was there, I would know from pain. And it's not, and they just kept on asking me from this angle, from that angle. And wouldn't you know, I haven't been asked again to say any more about it, but they just thought that, you get an ancient Near Eastern scholar, they're going to give you the whole scoop on this. And I didn't.
Yeah. So amongst Mesopotamian scholars, is it pretty sidebar? So before you even were aware of this, I'm sure you knew the word or knew of the word, but is it it's really just not,
it's not even a
emphasis?
Sidebar. It's a footnote on the sidebar.
So no Mesopotamian scholars really make any big deal of it.
I'm just going to say no. And so because of that, kind of if you want to evaluate a dollar bill, you study dollar bills. You don't evaluate the counterfeits. I'm sorry. I just don't have the time to look at the counterfeit stuff. And so like I've said, I'm just guessing that a mistaken hermeneutic, a research method that was flawed. And like I said, when you study ancient civilizations, and I'm sure this is in any field, you go to graduate school and you you have all your weird ideas, and then you find out, oh, that's not substantiated. How do you substantiate that? I'm thinking, oh, in fact, fellow graduate students would do that. When I would study, knowing that we're going to, we're let's say we were doing Enuma Elish in class, and so we'd meet once a week, and the graduate students, we'd sort of bound together. Hey, let's study together, and I'm studying together. Hey, I found this word. I think it means such and such. You're going to say, yeah, I looked at that too. That's stupid. You know why? Because this, and this. Oh, thank you so much, because I would have been so embarrassed in class to say something stupid like that. And so, in other words, you're training yourself, and then you're walking into class, and then the professor, who knows 100 times more than all of us, and saying, oh yeah, that's an interesting idea. So and so had that in 1932, but that was shown to be wrong by so and so in 1943, and so. But good try. And you're thinking, wow, I got a good try at least. and so you just can't do this stuff on your own.
Yeah. And so taking the Anunnaki, how you described it, I think what's difficult is everybody has a preconceived idea of Anunnaki. When they think Anunnaki, they are thinking more ancient aliens. So I'm not asking it in that way, but I'm asking it in the context that you put forth. Do we see any correlation between the Anunnaki and any other Mesopotamian gods or anything like we've talked about in the past? Like, do we see them connected to the Apkallu in any way? Is there any Anunnaki Nephilim connection?
No, nothing at all. The only connection would be that the Anunnaki, as the pantheon of gods, would be the equivalent in the Bible to the Elohim. When I say Elohim, I mean the heavenly beings. Except they're a little more particular. The Anunnaki gods are, like I said, they're the gods in general, but of course, sometimes, in fact, much more often, if I want to talk about the gods, I use the term gods plural, and Ilani, and that's in fact, it's etymologically connected to the term Elohim. I think it's probably got the same verbal root, which probably means something to do with power, so Anunnaki could be obliquely like using the term the gods or the sons of gods in the Bible. And of course...
but they wouldn't be the same.
Well, they are in the terms of essence, in meaning that when the Bible is talking about the gods, it's talking about the subordinate heavenly beings that clearly are different than Elohim himself, God, the one that with his personal name, YHWH, he's wholly different than all of the other ones. And that's implied in every point that you talk about it from the beginning of Genesis on, is that Elohim, the God, the unfortunate thing is that the terms are the same. But that's a problem with language, not with essence. And so I suppose you could say the Anunnaki are kind of like the plurality of all the heavenly beings mentioned in the Bible, which of course do not have the same category as God does. But
like our other episodes, it'd be like the wrong or perverted version, because I know when we talked Apkallu, there is that subtle, you said solid link between that was their version of the sons of God, because you can see in other texts, like, no, they're actually kind of acknowledging that and they're similar. It's just the wrong version of those events. Do the other Mesopotamian texts or any Jewish writings or anything give credence or pull from the Anunnaki to be like, no? So it's literally just off on its own.
There is no myth about the Anunnaki, and there probably wouldn't be, because, like I said, if that's just the generic term for the collection of the gods, no, they like to write myths about individual, gods, not just the collection of all of them together. And so maybe I'll be proven wrong, that they'll find, some cool myth about, the Anunnaki, but it hasn't been found, and I don't expect it ever would be.
So no correlation. Okay.
Yeah. And
so in terms of like how I would say mainstream media or Sitchin looks at it, they do depict it with this, which I was going to say it for maybe the next episode, but this alien-looking reptilian thing. Are you familiar with that little image?
No, but I will say this: there are no depictions of Anunnaki because, like I said, if it's simply the generic collection of gods, they all look different. And by the way, you can usually tell each god by the insignia next to it. Okay, so for example, Inanna, you can usually tell her because she's got two things that look like ski poles next to her. But each god wears a god-type hat, by the way. If you're wearing a hat with horns on it, that usually means you're a divine being, not a human being, because, of course, gods and humans pretty much look the same. Humans are never shown in iconographic depictions with full face. It's almost always sideways. Occasionally you'll find a divine being that is full frontal. Most time they're also sideways. But now I'm getting into art history weeds, and I'm going to start making mistakes if I go any further. But no, there are no depictions of Anunnaki in general or in particular because there are no particulars.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because then Heiser, because they do have this image of this reptilian-looking thing, but then on the flip side, he is stated very strongly. So, okay, you're saying there's no depictions of the Anunnaki. Then for some reason, this reptilian image, which I'm sure I'll just put up right over here, Heiser would say that's a prehistoric image. So we have no cuneiform or any writings on that image. And somehow they've been correlated and connected. But of the image that people think, which gives, because it's this reptilian-looking pointy head alien, which I'm sure influences why they think it's an alien, it is prehistoric. There's literally no writing telling you what that thing is.
And even if it was, it's not there's nothing in Mesopotamia to connect it to it. Nobody's writing a book on the Anunnaki. At least, I'm sorry, no pointy-headed reptilian Mesopotamian scholar is writing a book on this because there like I said, 4 obscure articles in German over the between around 1965 and about 1990. I mean, I can even tell you who the scholars are. They're all, one of them is von Soden, who I mentioned before. Let's see, who else did it? Falkenstein, who wrote in the 30s and 40s, Kienost, and then, so in von Soden. So, I mean, I don't know what else to say except that I hesitate to go and look at all those connections because it would probably frustrate the life out of me. This is everything I know, and I'm going to hold to this and nothing else. And if somebody says, they're such and such, my answer is it's not in a Mesopotamian text. Where did you get that?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, if there's Anunnaki people out there, I'm not trying to represent a poor straw man. I'm just coming from the little bit of knowledge I have. So I'm asking questions based off my understanding of it too. So I'm not trying to represent it wrong. But then because then you hear, okay, like I think the main thing is that the Anunnaki, right, they're mining for gold, and then they want to subordinate. They don't want to do it anymore. It's tough work, which then they breed people, which then all of a sudden we hear this breeding, and then, but again, if this whole premise is wrong, and we're reading into it of there have to be aliens, and then we're making a misconnection with the Anunnaki, then all this stuff just falls. But then as soon as we hear like either creating humans or breeding humans, we think, so there's a connection with Nephilim. But then your argument would be, but it's talking about the pantheon of gods, not.
And I think
not like that. I mean, but do the Anunnaki do that, right? The interbreeding to make humans?
No, it doesn't say that. Okay. No, it doesn't say that at all. But I think I'm guessing here. But if I were put on a witness stand and somebody asked me, "Why do you think this is happening?" I'm guessing that this appeals to our cosmic sensibilities. We really are looking outside of ourselves. We want that confirmation. We're looking for it. And here's somebody, the Sitchin or others, who are providing that confirmation for us, and they're confirming it from ancient texts. this is so cool. These ancient texts that are so obscure that are inaccessible to us. And if that's 30, 40 years ago, well, they're not inaccessible to you any longer. You can look this stuff up in translation. You can look up Stephanie Dowley and see how often the Anunnaki are used in Mesopotamian myths. You can look up a scholarly article on the Cuneiform library thing. Nicole Brish wrote a brief article on the Anunnaki. It's 3 pages where she basically summarizes the material, and it's like, is that it? And my answer is yeah. But you have to take somebody who's basically devoted their life to become a starving graduate student to work through this and suffer through it, just to get to the point of working with this material. So you have access to it. You have access to the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary. You can even look up some Sumerian material online. But all I can say is that if you were one of my students at school and they wanted to do a paper, let's say on the Anunnaki, and they came up with all this stuff, I'd say, well, let's go with the sources that actually talk about it from Mesopotamian texts themselves, and let's ignore this other stuff. And if they had an axe to grind, they would either say, no, I can't do that. I said, well, you can't write it for me then. I mean, you can't use the material like an open sieve. Now, by the way, Wikipedia has gotten much better, but in the old days, or even now AI, I looked up Anunnaki and AI, and it had 1 or 2 really nice articles, and then the other stuff was all this space alien stuff. I'm thinking, oh, AI doesn't know any better. It doesn't know, and Wikipedia didn't know any better. And so, when Wikipedia first started coming out, 25, 30 years ago, it was an open sieve. And I said, no, you can't use it. You don't know. It hasn't passed the litmus test. When I write an article for a journal, if I get published, it's because they send the article out usually to 2 blind peer reviewers. Hopefully they're not blind, but in other words, they're anonymous, and they'll look at the article and say, yeah, this is a good article. You should publish it, but they have to modify this, this, and this. And then if the reviewers especially are consistent with that, they'll come back to me and say, yeah, we'd like your article, but you've got to do this, this, and this. And depending on, I might say, no, I'm not willing to do that. No, thanks. I'll go somewhere else. Or they'll come back and say, both reviewers think your article's dumb. It doesn't cut the mustard, buddy. Sorry. And I've been on the other side before, where I've been a blind reviewer, and I'll look at an article missing. I hate to do this, because I've been on the other side where I get rejected. I'm saying, I'm going to have to reject this thing. I just recently got an invitation to look at an article. I already know I'm going to reject it, just based on the premise. And it's like, I feel really bad because somebody's worked really hard at it. But the thing is, it's gone through a process of evaluation. And so when people take topics like this and they decide to rush to the public audience that doesn't have a filter to know whether or not this is good or bad, it's sort of, it's not really very authentic. They're doing it. I mean, really think about it. Outside of my own field, I'm completely at the mercy of anybody who wants to tell me whatever they want. If I look at an article on medicine, I'm thinking, all right, at least I know how to do research and say, all right, well, this is from the Journal of the American Medical Association. Well, that's a respected peer-reviewed journal, so it probably has good information in it, and so, all right, I'll probably look at that article rather than something that's just online. But if somebody, let's say, publishes their own book, that's because nobody wanted to publish their book, then I'm suspicious. Or if somebody publishes a book, well, let's say Oxford Press, oh, well, that went through a really rigorous, peer review process. Colleague of my school, he had a book published with Brill, and I said, do you realize what this means? In my field, Brill is like the top of the line. You got published with Brill? I mean, I'm sitting there saying, wow, I didn't realize you were that important in your field. Man, I don't get published with Brill hardly ever. And so you have to go through all these process of sweat and tears. And if you're not willing to do it, it's not fair. Now, here I am, I'm putting myself out into the YouTube world, well, I've already suffered through 50 years of my ideas being called on the carpet. And by the way, most of my ideas are called like, what if this were true? Oh, come on, please. This, and this is already, this is why when I wrote my dissertation, I had to look up and see what everybody thought about the topic from the beginning of time to me. And then by the time I got there, I realized I don't think I have anything new to add anymore. I thought I had something really new, and I found out, oh yeah, they thought that. It's really, really hard to do. And now people have access to that information, and I'm here. I'm hoping my little contribution is to try to guide you into finding those good sources to use.
Yeah, with the influx of information, I think that the challenging struggle is it's not just finding information, because information is out there. There's a plethora of it, but I need to sift through to find credible information, which I think you're a good resource. So if people do have questions about like who should I read, or which commentary, who can be trusted, well, yeah, we want to know the peer-reviewed stuff, the trusted stuff, because especially me being the curious layman, I don't know all this stuff, and so you do have smart people putting stuff out there. But then I would say it is tricky to know, is it a credible source?
Been looking at the comments back and forth, and especially since we've been doing the Nephilim stuff, and I would say that there have been so many comments, most of them nice. Hey, you should have so-and-so on, or you should look at this book. And every time they've done that, I'm not familiar with it. It's like, I don't know who this person is. I don't know that. And I look them up and said, oh, I've never heard of them. They wrote a book on this? And then I look and realize, oh, it's either self-published or, so how can you write a book on that? There's no information on it from Mesopotamian sources. And then I'll look the person up and I'll see, oh, they talked about the Abkalu and they gave a completely wrong etymology based upon a flawed understanding of cuneiform. Oh, if they did that, that's like the first day of class. Something's wrong here. This is why I've never heard of this book, because I'm on my own little world. And so I have to tell you, when that happens, I don't have the time to look at all that material and evaluate it. It's better for me to evaluate the stuff that I know and that's peer reviewed. And if that becomes boring or even offensive, I'm going to do the best I can. Yeah. And by the way, that's all Mike Heiser did. Mike Heiser, you look at it, it's sort of quote unquote boring, because whenever Mike would provide a source, I'm thinking, he knows where to get the sources. And he was the scholar in residence at Logos, which had their whole library of everything there. And so he knew where to find the stuff. Oh, and by the way, he got his degrees at the University of Penn State and at UW-Madison. And by the way, he worked with Fox, the great taskmaster. So I'm sure he was put in his place 1,000 times. He went through the rigor to do all this stuff. And so he knew where to find all this stuff. I remember when I gave lectures up at Logos in 2014 twice, and both times I went up there, guess who wasn't there to meet me? Mike Heiser. It was like, I think you were avoiding me, but I finally got to meet him a few years later, and we had a really wonderful time out in Southern California at a meeting. But anyway, he did his homework. When others don't really do their homework, it's really hard. It's almost like taking a steam shovel to my field and just like unearthing everything and without a critical apparatus or letting others look at your material to decide. That's how scholarship moves on. It's like, you have an idea, I have an idea, we put our heads together, we find out some of my ideas. I had a cockamamie idea, you had a cockamamie idea. All right, they got left to the forefront, but together we came and had some good ideas, and we move on. And now the next generation is building upon what we knew. New information comes up. It's a really long, slow, sweaty process, and it's not fair when it's bypassed.
Yeah. And it's understandable for other people, because you don't know what you don't know. And
And so, yeah, when you're talking about, well, I knew it was wrong because I knew the etymology was wrong. It's like, well, all the Keegans out there are going, well, I didn't know what etymology was, so I definitely didn't know the etymology was wrong. You know what I mean? So you can only know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. So it's understandable.
Can I quote that?
You can put it up on a plaque, put it on your. I can make a picture, put it on your fridge for you if
Let
you
me
want.
do it in Akkadian. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. I'll do it in Keegan Cuneiform. How about that? But no, I think this is a good spot to stop. We'll for sure dive into more questions on the next episode when we talk about the planet of Nibiru. We'll have some more time to discuss some other questions and the work as a whole once we get the bigger picture. But good spot to stop. So we appreciate you guys for tuning in and watching. And if you do have questions, I'm sure we will get quite a few questions. We'll handle them the best we can. We'll include some of the books and some of the resources down below. Otherwise, yeah, as always, if you have questions, you want to talk to Dr. Mark Chavalas about anything, feel free to comment below. We have our email attached below as well, and he will field those questions. And so, yeah, we appreciate you guys tuning into this, and we'll see you next time when we talk about the planet of Nibiru. All right, see you guys.
Bye.